go and see my wife, make sure she's all right. So he did. I phoned Liz up and I said, I don't think it's going to work, darling. And I told her all this, and she simply said, come home. The story went that his plane he was in was hit, and it was on fire, and they were limping back. And Les put his hands in his pockets and had his face burned rather than ruin his hands for the people.
Welcome to the third episode of The Man Behind the Mason, where I sat down with Paul Hankinson. The lack of a set format for these video podcasts has allowed the guests to shape the recording in their own way and to talk about what's important to them. This episode is no different. I'm sure you'll agree, we really do get to know the story that shaped Paul as the man behind the Mason. But as always, before we get started, I'd like to just ask those of you that haven't done so to press the subscribe button in order to support the channel. And if you enjoy this episode, hit the thumbs up. So who's Paul? You Bristol born?
No, not at all. No, I'm from Plymouth.
Oh.
I'm 71, just, and I'm from Plymouth, born in Plymouth, Devonport in Plymouth, actually. I am a bit of a cliche, the son of a sailor and a barmaid. Yeah, both wonderful people. My father always told me that he's from Manchester. My father, great joker, my dad. And the last thing he ever said to me was a joke. I might tell you about that later on. He was in Manchester as a young lad, he was 19 or something, 20. This was in about 1950. And his older brother, Les, had just come back from doing his 2 years national service. And he joined the army, or he'd been sent into the army. He was sent to Malaya. Now, anyone knows anything about history, in Malaya, at that time of history, was a pretty dangerous place. Anyway, Les came back with some horror stories about what he'd seen there, about the assassinations and the bombings in the cafes and sniper shootings when they were supposed to be off duty. He scared my dad so much that rather than risk 2 years in the army, he went and signed on for 7 in the Navy. And he ended up doing about 14 or something. Came out as a petty officer. And he was sent down to Plymouth because at that time there were 3 places along the south coast, manning ports as they were called. There was Chatham, Portsmouth and Plymouth. These were the 3 places where sailors were sent and then sent to do their ships and their initial training. And he was sent to Plymouth. And that's where he met my mother. And they got together. And that was that. It was all very quick. They met, courted, married, and conceived me all in a very short space of time, less than a year. But it's a corny old line, but there was a war on at the time.
Is that where they stayed? They stayed in Plymouth? Or?
Well, my mother did, but my father had to go. He was sent off to the Korean War theatre aboard a big aircraft carrier, HMS Unicorn. He was held back a couple of times, but in the end, he had to go, and he left in December of 1951, when I was born in January 1952, and by the time he got back, I was 3 years old.
Oh, wow.
That's the way it was then. It wasn't. I remember him saying in 1982, when the Falklands crisis was on, we were sitting watching some news program, and there was returning squaddies and sailors, and they were saying, when we've been away from home for 6 months, it's been unbearable, 6 months. And the dad sort of grumbled, 3 years I was away, so there's no party for me when I came home.
Yeah.
But Korea was an embarrassment all round.
So your kind of formative years then?
Yeah, they were all in Plymouth. I was born in Devonport, in Plymouth, but at the time, my mother, dad was away. My mother was living with grandfather in Tor Point, which is, anybody knows, is on the other side of the river, in Cornwall, and that's where I was raised, really. My granddad was at that time. He was an ex-merchant sailor too. He often said he spent most of the war floating around the North Sea on a duckboard because he was in merchant navy and North Atlantic convoys and constantly getting ship shot out from under him. But at that time, he was a stoker on the ferry, the old Tor Point ferry, which is still running. I suppose it's diesel now. But back then, the engine was my grandfather and a big pile of coal. So they lived in a tied cottage over there in Tor Point. And as I was growing up, my granddad was the man, you know?
Yeah.
He was the guy that raised us. He was the one that everybody went to. My three uncles, right up to when my grandfather died, my three uncles, who were then grown men with families of their own, if they ever had a problem, they'd always go and talk to Granddad about it.
The traditional head of the family kind of figure.
He was the head of the family. And he was a marvellous man, my grandfather. I loved him dearly. Well, we all did, because it's a big family. I've got 3 uncles and an aunt, who sadly died now. There was another brother who died very young, which I never knew, but there were 6 children. And they all had quite big families, although my mother didn't, just me. All the others had large families. I've got 15 first cousins.
Wow. And so growing up without siblings, were you quite close with cousins?
I had the cousins, We all lived pretty close together.
Right. I
had the cousins. I was the oldest. I was the first grandchild. The next one down to me, 6 or 7 years younger than me, Gary, and then they go on from there. But as I was growing up, I remember we never quite sure where we were going to be eating dinner that night. You know, sometimes it'd be at Mum's, or if she was working, we'd go to Gran's, or we'd go to Auntie Jill, and you're never quite sure how many cousins would be there either. So it's that kind of thing. And we'd all be, at weekends, everybody gravitated over to Granddad's in Tor Point, and we wouldn't be without him.
So it sounds like what you missed out on with your father being away was kind of more than made up for in the extended family.
Yeah, with grandfather and my uncles and so on. And Granddad used to be. Granddad was, I'd say, he was the chap who had to raise 6 children on his own, because different story, but him and my grandmother split up when I was very young, probably before I was born, actually. Anyway, he had 6 kids to raise, and he always had some way of earning a few bob more. We would, when I was a little lad, he had this big boat, which I think was an old lifeboat or something, which he would row, and when they were younger, my uncles would go with him, and later on when they grew up and I would go with him, he'd row it up the river, up the Tamar, and beach it on the mud flats. And then we'd have these long rakes, and we'd get a huge, great mound of cockles in the bottom of the boat, and then row back down, boil them up in this great big pot. And over the weekends, Friday and Saturday evenings, he and I would be off at the pubs around Tor Point, because selling these cockles in little plates to the sailors. You know, he had a big basket. And everybody knew that Mash was coming along. Mash, that was his nickname, Mash Hardy. And we'd be selling these cockles. And I'm about 10 years old at the moment, but it doesn't matter, you know, we're in the pubs then. All these sailors are coming from the barracks outside Tor Point, Raleigh and Fisgard. Another one would be his mackerel fishing. He'd go out in the same boat with his little brandy barrels with lines of feathers on them, hauling in piles of mackerel, because mackerel are stupid fish. Anyone's ever fished them, they'll tell you they'll eat anything. Anything shiny, they'll go for it. And then they'd be in his trolley, and we'd be taking them up around the town, selling them to all the housewives that'd be coming out when he came along with his barrow of mackerel. Did you go to school? You went to school down there as well then? I went to school in Devonport, yeah. Yeah, first of all. Actually, I've got to go back. There's another little element of this story. While my father was away at sea, in all that time, they, shall I say, parted company. My mother was lovely, lovely lady, but how can I describe her? Vivacious, I think, is probably the right word. Mum wasn't going to be without company for long, shall I say. Anyway, while he was over there, one of his oppos, as they say in the Navy, one of his friends on the ship was coming back earlier. So apparently my dad said this to me afterwards. He said, when you get back to Guz is what Devonport is referred to in the Navy. Right. Guz. When you get back to Guz, go and see my wife, make sure she's all right. So he did. and she was. And anyway, they divorced. But my mother always said, your father was always a gentleman. She said there was never any animosity, there was never any cruelty, nothing. It's just that they were young. They were in their teens.
Yeah.
They were young. There was a war on. Blimey, they'd only just come out of the second one. We're talking about 1951, 52. You know, it's within pretty stark memory of the Second World War, really. Only 14, 15 years before. Blimey, rationing didn't finish till 1956, so things were still tough. People took their joy where they could. It was just wrong. It was all too fast. They were young. The only good thing that came out of it, she said, was me.
And how aware were you of all of this happening at the time?
Well, I was very aware. Well, my earliest memories, actually, I didn't talk to anybody. How young were you when you can remember things? You'd probably say 4 or 5. Now, I know that what happened was, when my father came back, things are completely different now. But when my father came back and met me, again, I was 3 years old, he wanted to take me to Manchester, where he was from. And the situation was, my mum had been the one who had gone off the rails, as it were. So he took me to Manchester, where I stayed with his parents while he was away in the Navy. But
who I guess you probably didn't even really know that much at that time.
I didn't know them at all. I got some very strange memories. I had this very, very vivid memory of when I was very young. I used to go to see my gran, his mother then, and she lived in this huge, great red mansion next to a river. Now, when I went back there again when I was in my 20s, this huge red mansion was a little council house in Cadishead, and the river was the Manchester Ship Canal. That's what you're like when you're a little lad. But anyway, again, as he told me later on, while this was going on, my mother constantly was going backwards and forwards to Manchester, begging him to let me go back with her to Plymouth. And in the end, he did so, because he had remarried. And the woman that he remarried, she wasn't cruel at all, but she wasn't particularly interested in me because I wasn't hers. And when they had another baby of their own, my sister, or half-sister, she sort of neglected me completely. And when I was about 5, my father suddenly realized that I was unhappy, and he finally agreed to let me go back. So I came back to Devonport and went to school there.
It's interesting because
I met my father when I was 21.
Did you?
Yeah.
I was going to say it's interesting because it's not. It's probably not, and I wouldn't know, but it's probably not a common upbringing for a lot of people of that era.
No.
Because you hear all of the stories of adoptions that happened at that time for obvious reasons. And even into the 80s and the 90s, I know being at school, even back then, everybody knew that 1 or 2 children whose parents had split up. It still wasn't a common occurrence then. So quite a unique upbringing for you, really.
It was strange and disjointed. I've never felt anything bad about it. I don't carry around any great angst. Because I know I had 2 loving parents who continued to love me to the ends of their days.
Just with separate lives?
Well, I'll come around to that. It's a funny little story that ends it all. When I was in my 20s, early 20s, I had a girlfriend who's not my current wife now. On one occasion, we went down to Cornwall for a holiday. We went camping down Penzance way. And on the way back, of course, I went to see my granddad, as I always do. And I went in there, and my granddad said, "Guess who called in the other week?" I said, "I don't know, who was it?" He said, "Your father came in." He was then there with his wife, his 4th wife, as it turns out. My grandfather, my dad had a marriage certificate to whom it may concern written on it. He was one of those fellas that everybody wanted to be Hank's friend. Everybody wanted to be on his team. Lovely man, very, very popular chap. Anyway, he'd left me a letter. Did I want to get in touch with him? And I spoke to my mum about it.
You're 21, did you say?
I was 21,
yeah.
And I'd come up, gone to school, gone to a grammar school in Plymouth, and I'd left school at 17, I went in the Merchant Navy because I didn't know what else to do. This was 1969, and careers advice in Plymouth then was a bit sketchy. It was Dockyard or Navy, which one do you want to do? But I didn't fancy either of those, so I went into the Merchant Navy. I only did one trip. It was just under a year. It's just when I figured out what I wanted
Work
to,
out what you want to do.
The only thing I was ever any good at school was drawing. I was very good at art, technical drawing. I devoured, people who remember technical drawing, engineering drawing. Anyway, when I left, I got an apprenticeship with what was then the Ministry of Public Buildings and Works in Westbury-on-Trim. I came to Bristol and started my training with them as an architectural technician, going through the college, ONC, HNC. Anyway, back to our holiday. And my granddad says, you got this letter from your dad. So, and there was a phone number. So I said to Mum, what do you think? And she said, well, talk to him. I've always said he was a nice man. There was never any animosity.
How long had you not had contact with him at this point?
Since I came back when I was 5. Never
Right.
even thought about it. And I phoned him up and we had this very strange conversation. And after a couple of phone calls, he said, can I come down and meet you? And I said, yeah, of course you can, if you want. So one day he got on the train and I met him, and there was this little fella, and we shook hands, and he said, well, where do you think we should go? And I said, well, you fancy a pint? And he went, oh, yeah, let's have a drink. So we went into a pub. The first thing he asked me was, what's your name? Because my mother had remarried his oppo,
Right.
who was called Griffiths, Welshman, and he wondered if I'd been adopted and changed my name. And I said, my name's Hankinson. And another
Sigh of relief.
sigh of relief. And we never had a crossword for the rest of his life. Wonderful, wonderful man. I loved him to bits. We were very similar, the same sense of humor. I obviously inherited that from him, as he was a Mancunian. And he went to school with Bernard Manning and Colin Compton, and people might remember those. So that was the kind of people he grew up with. Great jokers, always a crack to be coming out. Softened the hard lives they had up there, I suppose. So we had a great time together. And then this girlfriend came and went, and I eventually met my wife, who is now my wife. It's our 41st wedding anniversary on Monday, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah. Liz and I have been together 41 years, well, 45 years really, married for 41. And when we got married in Bristol, because she was from East London.
Right, so she was from East London. You came up to Bristol because you got this job in Westbury-on-Trim.
She came down to Bristol to visit some people she'd met on holiday in Jersey the year before, who happened to be friends of mine. They naturally brought her into the pub on the Saturday, where I was behind the bar because I was a student, as lots of people do. This was the Golden Lion on Gloucester Road.
Right.
And we met there, and that was that. Now, when we got married in Bristol, there was a coachload came down from London, coachload came down from Manchester, my father's people, and a coachload up from Plymouth, my mother's. So these 3 huge coaches descended on this little church in Bishopston, and my mother and father met for the first time in all those years. Now, my mum was alone at the time, but Dad was with his then wife. And that was that. Year after that, when Liz became pregnant, our daughter was born 2 months premature, very, very tiny. She was only 3.5 pounds born. And she spent the first 3.5 weeks of her life in the special care unit at Southmead. And, oh God, this is so complicated. There's so much has happened now you're getting me to talk about it. When we knew she was pregnant, we were waiting to tell my dad and Frida, who was his then wife. And I'll talk about it later, I got a lot involved in diving, scuba diving in the 80s. We were on a holiday, we were on a diving weekend down at Swanage, and my dad and Frida were on a dancing weekend, ballroom dancing, in Bournemouth. And we drove over to tell them that the baby had been born. And they were both delighted, because Frida, a lovely lady she was, another Mancunian lady, she was barren Never had children, but she treated us like hers, and she was a lovely lady. Anyway, blow me down. Towards the end of the week they're dancing, she died. She had a massive heart attack. While she shook, she smoked like a chimney. Totally unexpected. She had on the dance floor, she just bang, hit the floor. And she died because my father was devastated. So I was backwards and forwards to Manchester to see him about this. But anyway, when our baby was born, we got my dad coming down from Manchester to see us, my mum coming up from Plymouth to see us, and they're talking about each other. They've both grown up now, and they're talking. The baby's born, Tamar was born. I called her Tamar after the river. And they were coming down to visit. Mum's coming up, Dad's coming down. And about 6 months after that, my father was then in his mid-50s. He'd left the Navy with a good pension, and he was working for Ferranti. He was an engineer working for Ferranti that made brake lining machines and so on. He was a troubleshooter. One of these guys always had a little suitcase packed. And there's a machine in Frankfurt that's broken down, Hank, go and fix it. So we'd have to go over there and fix the machinery like that. They'd offered him a good package, and he came down. He said one day on a visit, he said, got something to talk to you about. I said, yeah, what's up now? He said, well, I'm thinking of taking retirement. I can afford it. I've got this and I've got that. I said, yeah, great. What are you going to do? And he looked a bit sheepish, and he said, in his northern accent, he said, I'm going to sell up and move to Plymouth and live off at Brush with your mother. Live over the brush means just shack up. And they did. And they were together till he died.
Wow.
So in 25 years, this big circle went around. And my mother and father finished their lives up together.
Down in Plymouth?
In Plymouth, yeah. Strange, just the way things go. So that was that. But yeah, Dad died much too soon. He was only 68. He had this massive, great cancer inside him that they didn't, it wasn't diagnosed in time, and he was taken very, very quickly.
Well, it sounds like he found his place in the end, though.
Oh, yeah,
after all of
absolutely.
that, 4 wives later, and
the stories he used to tell. Because when he was down there, he got on very well with my mother's 2 younger brothers, who were. He was then. Let me see. He must have been 20, and my uncle Malcolm was 19. Des was 18. Malcolm's in the Air Force. Dad's in the Navy, and Des was the only one that had a suit. So if one of the others had a date, they used to borrow the suit. That's the way it went.
so you move up to Bristol.
So I moved to Bristol.
You're working in, where was it?
Westbury-on-Trim. It became the Property Services Agency, the PSA of the Department of the Environment, up at Burkill Road.
And what did that involve?
Well, I was trained to be an architectural draftsman, and they were. It was a 4-year training course. During that time, I would go to college at Brunel College.
Right. Yeah.
Ashley Down. Did my ONC there and HNC afterwards. Higher National Certificate in building construction. The work there involved, funnily enough, I'm still subject to the Official Secrets Act.
Oh, yeah.
Even after all these years, it never runs out. We would design things for post office, telephone exchanges, post offices, a lot of ministry work. Did quite a lot of work down at Yeovilton Air Station,
Right.
Yeovilton Barracks and places like that, Army recruit. Anything that was government buildings, we would get involved with design works for.
And how long were you there?
4 years. Did my ONC and HNC there. And then I moved from then to what was North Haven District Council in Chipping Sodbury. Worked in the architects department there for 6 years, from 74 to 80. Yeah, it was an interesting time. That was again drawing, design work for housing estates, but that was in the days when councils used to build their own houses, the council houses. And I learned a lot during those 6 years because the process was complete. It started off with, if there's a bit of land, go and survey it, see what space we've got. And then there was what houses could we get on there, and working drawings, and liaising with builders and taking the whole process all the way through. It was a very interesting time.
And is that an industry you stayed in through your whole career then?
I've always had a connection with building, design, and construction project management. But it's true to say I've taken a few little side shoots off. People have often said to me, "What did you do?" And my usual answer is, "Well, you tell me a year, and I'll tell you what I was doing then." But while I was doing this, next thing that happened was our baby was born, and I was made redundant from a builder that I was working with at the time as well. A friend of mine, or somebody that became a friend of mine, had a building and construction company, and I went to work for him as a project manager and general Lord High everything. The company had to slim down in the early 80s, shall we say, as lots did back then, and I was made redundant, and Liz was pregnant. Now, I thought, well, what am I going to do? And she said, well, I'll tell you what, at the time she was working for a company called Matthew Hall, who are mechanical engineers. I don't know if they still exist. They used to have their offices down in Ashton,
right,
not far from the football ground there. She said they've got a number of mechanical design draftsmen working there who are contracted to them by a company called Elgood and I. So she said, shall I have a word with one of the chaps and get you the name of their agent? And she did. And I met this fella who is, I'll say his name now, Tony Murphy. You can cut that if you think you should. But Tony and his wife Pat and his daughters they got me a job. As soon as I met him, he got me a job. And I worked with them for many years. And he put me out on contract to architect. I worked for most of the architect practices in Bristol, 6 months here, 9 months there. I was with Ferguson Mann and many of the architects, John Saxon, who did a lot of church work. And we became really good friends, and our families became close. And we're still close now. In fact, the weekend just gone, we were down in Windsor celebrating his 80th birthday.
Oh, wow.
And he is the master, or he was the master of the lodge that I belong to now. He's the chap that introduced me to Freemasonry. He was master at the time when I joined in 1993. He initiated, pastored and raised me. And he's now an honorary member of our lodge. He's gone right through it. So we're still friends now.
You mentioned then going into Masonry. How were you introduced to it? Were you working with him at the time?
Yeah.
Was this after he's got you the job?
I was working with him from, when Tamar was born, from 83, 84. And he asked me in 1992, it must have been, if I considered it.
Took him 8 years to suss you out and make sure.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it was strange. Now, there's a funny story about it, actually. The overall boss of the company was a chap called John Upward, who he was a big old Somerset, red-faced farming type of fellow. He wasn't really, that's just the way he came across. He used to come into the drawing office. At one point, there was a drawing office, which they set up that I ran for them, when we did a lot of work for the atomic energy site in Winfrith in Dorset, which I also can't talk about, but we set up a drawing office because we did a lot of design work for them, for the radioactive handling facilities down there. And he would come in sometimes, and quite regularly for a while, and then he would say, could you draw me up a seating plan? I've got a dinner which I'm arranging. I said, yeah, of course I can. And he'd give me the thing, and I'd look at it, and there's all these names and tables. And after a few months of this, I realized that they were seating plans for the Masonic dinner.
Right.
The festive board, as they call it, outside of Bristol. He was a member of the Lodge of Agriculture down at Yatton. In fact, I think he was a Somerset provincial steward or something towards the end. And I would do this. And one day, he came in, and I thought, here's another table plan. And he said, what are you doing for lunch? I said, nothing in particular. He said, got something I'd like to show you. you want to come with us? Yeah. So he picked me up lunchtime, and we got in his beat-up old Rover that he used to drive, Rover 3000. And we drove off down to Somerset, and we're driving through Yatton High Street, and we pulled in to the Masonic Hall. Now, I've obviously been aware that there were such places, never seen one. And we pulled into this, between these big stone pillars, and this great stone edifice. It looked like the Munster's house. He said, "This is Masonic Hall." I said, "Oh, yeah." And he started to show me around. He said, "No, this is our dining room." He said, "I'll take you up to the lodge room," and led me up the stairs and showed me the lodge room. And then we're looking around the dining room and the downstairs. Now he said, "Something I'd like to ask you." And he laid this fatherly hand on my shoulder. And I thought, "Oh, blimey." I said, "What is it?" He said,
Were you worried at this point?
"No." He said, "Could you do me some drawings for the new ladies' toilets?" "Oh, yeah, all right." And of course, so that was, it's your buck, you're the boss, I'll do whatever you want. So I did the drawings for his ladies' toilets, and it was 4 or 5 years later that Tony actually asked me if I'd like to join here. So in I came into Royal Sussex Lodge. I've been there ever since. Been master 5 times.
5?
Yeah, that's the way it goes.
You were secretary for quite a number of years
I
as
was
well, weren't you?
secretary. Yeah, you've done your homework. Yeah.
Well, no. So I came to Royal Sussex Lodge. My first visit would have been in 2017.
I was secretary.
And I think you just come out the chair then, either 27 or 28.
Yeah,
and you just
16. I was in the chair then. Yeah, I was chair first of all in 2002. So from 1993 to 2002, that's a reasonable gap, isn't it? Did that, and then again in 2016. Then I went in 2018. No, I went in 2019 as well. And at that time, we had 2 guys in the lodge, senior and junior wardens, who were really going to be good. They were as keen as mustard. And I was really looking forward to installing Steve Shrubsole as master. Blow me down. In that year, within a couple of months, they both died.
Oh, no.
Steve was 56. He was a big bloke. He was Lieutenant Commander, Royal Navy, retired. So he was used to handling people, and he was really going to be good. He just didn't wake up one day. He had this strange, undiagnosed heart condition, I suppose. He suffered from sleep apnea. We knew that much, but he just didn't wake up one day. And a couple of months after that, the junior warden succumbed to his prostate cancer. So we're stuck. You can imagine there's a great big hole in the progression.
Yeah.
So I stayed in. 2020, of course, was a load of nothing, wasn't it, with the COVID. But we kept it together with Zoom meetings and phone calls and so on. And then we picked it up again in 21.
So outside of Masonry, what do you get up to?
Well, I say in the early 80s, I've been swimming and snorkeling and mucking about in water all my life, really, ever since I don't ever remember not being able to swim. Mother used to say I could swim before I could walk. But, when you're raised in Plymouth and Devonport, and my stomping ground was the south coast of Cornwall during the summers, it was a natural thing to do. I'd always been fascinated with Jacques Cousteau and Hans and Lottie Haas. The older ones may remember those two on the television in black and white, underwater exploration. And there was, I was about 14 or 15, a couple of us fancied trying it. We went down to Army Navy surplus store, Knight's Army Navy surplus store in Devonport, which is still there. Everybody from them knows it. We put our paper delivery money together, and we bought an old Avon rubber Navy diving suit. It's the one which is all one piece, and you had to pull the neck out and climb in it, and do it up with straps. And an old regulator, one of those with the big concertina tubes. And then went into my granddad's workshop and took it apart and thought, oh, so that's how it worked, and then put it back together again. And went to there's a little harbour in Devonport. Again, people may know it, a place called Mutton Cove. It's where little boats come in. And I was the test pilot, and I dived in there. I was only a couple of meters below the surface. 10 minutes, and I came up soaking wet, having breathed more seawater than anything else. And that was the end of that diving career. The thing was like a tea bag, but it was always in there. And then in the early 80s, I decided I wanted to see if I could take it up properly. So I joined a dive club in Bristol. There were a number of scuba diving clubs in Bristol affiliated to the British Sub-Aqua Club. And I joined one in Henbury, called Sevenside Sub-Aqua Club. The thing that sparked me off, actually, was in 1982. You may remember the Mary Rose was finally raised out of the Solent. And I was watching the programs about it. And I remember the archaeologist in charge was a little lady called Margaret Rule, Dr. Margaret Rule. And she was a dumpy little thing, looked like Dawn French. And on this particular program, she said, the time has come when I couldn't rely on, we were getting close to raising it, I couldn't rely on reports from the divers anymore, or photographs or film. I had to feel it myself. I had to know what the state of that timber was and what we could and couldn't do with it. So she said, I went and joined a BSAC club and learned to dive. And this little light bulb went on. I thought, wow, this little lady can do it. I'm pretty sure I can. So I did some research and found this club quite close to where we were living, and I went and joined. And I was with them for years. I went through instructor training with them, first at club level and then at advanced level, which was almost national. I was their diving officer for 3 years. I was responsible for arranging dives and the safety measures.
When did you stop? Or are you still diving?
Well, I dive high days and holidays these days. When there's somebody there ready with a mint julep or something to swap for my weight belt. You know, I don't. My days of getting up at 5 o'clock to tow a boat for 3 hours to bricks and breakwater here have long gone. I don't do that anymore. But I dived with them until like 1989. That's when, and I was an advanced instructor then, and that's when the latest recession came along, pretty much like we're in, or we've just gone through, and hopefully we're coming out of. And there was another one back in the late 80s, and things got rough again. And I was made redundant from Elgin and Dye, from Tony's company. It's hard commercial decision they had to make. Now, for a couple of years, I had been going over to Mallorca to dive on holidays. Because, again, I had another diver friend in Bristol who'd been there and told me about it, and I went on holiday with the family and met these guys who, English guys, who had a little dive business on Mallorca. And after the first couple of times, the very first time I went, actually, and they sussed out that I was a qualified instructor, there was a little group of expats who lived on the place who wanted to learn, and they wanted to start their own British Sub-Aqua Club. So I helped them to do that. And I went back maybe a couple of times a year for a few years then, helping them out, and they would pay me, and it would pay for the holiday, really. I'd work for a week and then have a holiday for a week. It was a really nice way. But when things fell apart in the late 80s and I was made redundant, I got it into my head that I might as well go and move there, because this fella that ran it was on his own. He needed help. So I did. I went over to Mallorca to work in the dive centre.
And stayed there?
Well, I stayed there during the summer of 1990. Liz at home, she was packing up ready to go. She'd rented our house out. Everything we had was in boxes, piled into the back of our car. She'd resigned. She'd taken our daughter out of school. She was all fixed and ready to come over and join me. But around about the August, late July, August, a couple of things happened over there, and I realised that it really wasn't going to work. It was too many palms to grease over in Mallorca. You know, there were too many hoops you had to run through and to run a business. And it was very, very difficult. But the main thing was, I discovered when I was looking through, or I had a lawyer over there, it's called an abogado, looking at the contractual element of buying into this business. And he discovered that although this fella had bought it from a Belgian called Danny, who still ran a restaurant, and it was in his car park where the dive centre was, his father had set the thing up back in the 50s. It's Danny's father had set it up in the 50s. But back then, when Franco was in power, there was a law in place that no business could be set up in Spain unless it was 51% owned by a Spaniard. And that company still had that situation. So I wasn't going to be buying 50% of a business. I was going to be buying into 50% of 49%. And at any time in the future, some guy could knock on the door and say, "Hola, half of this is mine." That's the way it works in Spain. The saying goes, Spain wins again. So I phoned Liz up and I said, "I don't think it's going to work, darling." And I told her all this, and she simply said, "Come home." So I did. And this was in late 1990. We were homeless, jobless, and no school to send our daughter to at that moment. But then friends came round, and it was summer holidays, must have been in August. Because a lot of our friends who were teachers said, "Well, we're going to France for a month, live in our house." And someone else said, "Oh, well, we're going here for a fortnight, move into there." And the people that had rented our house, when they heard the story, said, "Well, we'll get out as soon as we can," and they did. So.
Yeah. Any other hobbies apart from diving?
Any other hobbies? Well, that went on. I'm still diving, as I said. There's the golf now. I started playing golf about 20 years ago. So I'm not very good at it, but then again, it's too late to.
You can't just say you're not any good at it. Handicap?
22. Oh. I want to get it down.
It's about 100 less than me.
I think I can get it down when we start playing properly. I think I should. I'd like to get down to 18, even now that I'm, getting on a bit. I think I can get it down to 18. A shot hole is enough for a grown man. I joined Chipping Sodbury Golf Club. When was that? When I first, probably 15 years ago or something. But I was still working then, solidly, and I could only play at weekends, and of course there's family to consider, and it wasn't really worth me doing it. No, hang on, it must have been longer than that, because it was 15 years ago that I went self-employed, and I didn't have the disposable to do it. So it's slightly longer. Then I resigned from there, and I joined Shirehampton Golf Club 8 years ago now. I played with the seniors, and I was seniors captain in 2021. I have a great time up there with them. I'm still playing 2 or 3 times a week now.
Nice.
Playing matches and so on with the seniors. We play, I think, 23 friendly matches a year with other seniors clubs around the area, with home and away games. Yeah. So there's that, and Liz and I have been dancing together, well, for years, ever since we've known each other, really. We're dancing in various forms. We've been to lessons. We dance French jive, La Roque, and I think it was probably about 10 years ago we started having serious ballroom lessons.
Any competitions?
No, it's not to that. So it's
just for fun.
Purely for fun. Although we haven't danced for a while, because, well, a couple of things happened. Christmas Eve, 3 years ago, Liz was out delivering Christmas cards, and she stepped off a step in the dark, stepped off a step awkwardly and fell. And because she did the natural thing, put her arm down and snapped, broke the bone at the bottom of her arm. Fortunately, not her wrist. It was the head of what's the big one called? Is it the ulna of the radius? I can never remember. Anyway, she snapped that off, quite a clean break. And it healed quite quickly. It took about 3 months to heal. Just as it was healing and we could go back to dancing, COVID hit. So we didn't dance for all that time, and we haven't taken it back up again. But I'd like to.
Yeah, you should.
I'd like to take it back up. But we still, you know, when we've got things going on, we go to parties and dances and things. If a decent bit of music comes on, we will still get up and dance. But big thing now, of course, our grandson. We've got a
new grandson.
Yeah, only 5 weeks old.
Do they live local to
Five
you?
and a half. Yes. Tom and Tamar are a measured 7-minute walk away,
Right.
just down the road. They used to live at Henbury, but we helped them to get a nice house not far away from us. Little Alfred was born. He's precious. Tamar's well, she's nearly 40, and she's left it rather late in life. But as she said, she had to kiss a lot of frogs before she found her prince, and it took a bit of time. And she and Tom met about 5 years ago now, I think, and they've been married for nearly 4 years. And they've been through a grueling IVF route, but they finally got
what they wanted.
little Alfred, and he's a charmer.
So what's the future hold? What's next? Any big plans? More of the same?
Let me see. What are we going to be doing? Well, another good friend of ours in Lodge and his wife, we decided, the four of us, 4 or 5 years ago, the four of us are going to have one big holiday a year together until either our backs or our money runs out. So far, we've done South Africa, we did Vietnam and Cambodia.
Wow.
That was fabulous.
I bet.
Really was. Lovely people, fascinating history, especially Cambodia. This year in June, we're going to Canada for nearly 3 weeks. And after that, who knows? But the future now is, Liz is, she took up bowling, bowling 6 years ago, and she is now lady captain at Henley's Bowling Club. So we're always the sort of people that get involved, you know.
Yeah.
We don't
get stuck in.
have
a job.
Just do something. We get stuck in. I'm hoping that Tamar, my daughter, will get back to her singing, because she was from a very early age. She was fascinated with the theatre, and she's done a lot of musical theatre, purely in an amateur way, but a good amateur way. Bristol Opera Company and people like that. She's appeared on the Hippodrome stage and the Redcliffe and places like that. Because since she's been married, and having the child, it's fallen off a little bit. But I hope she'll get back to singing, because she's got a belting voice. She's got the voice for the
radio,
the big number, you know, the voice for the big number. Got it off my mother. It skipped a generation with me, but my mum was always a good singer. And my grandfather, well, he would never turn down a chance to get up on stage and sing. I've got an early memory of my granddad with his cousin Les, who coincidentally is the same as my uncle Les. Now Les was, I always remember Les because he had terrible scarring on his face. He had lots of grafts. Because during the war he was in the Air Force. And I don't quite know what he did in the Air Force, but he was in airplanes. And he was a fabulous pianist. And whenever him and my granddad got together in a pub somewhere in Tor Point, Les would get on the piano and Granddad would be up singing. Fantastic pianist he was. And the story went that his plane he was in was hit and it was on fire and they were limping back. And Les put his hands in his pockets and had his face burned rather than ruin his hands for the piano. And that was the story, and it really was. It was.
Wow.
It was like. Do you remember those pictures of Niki Lauda after the racing driver that was burned up badly?
Formula One.
Very shiny skin grafting that goes on. That's what Les was like, and but his hands were fine, and he played the piano.
Carried on playing. Lovely.
Yeah, always.
Well, thanks for doing this.
No, it's my pleasure.
Great to learn more about your story, and I'm sure everyone else would be really interested to watch.
It's been an interesting life, I suppose, and it still is. So we've got the little lad now, and I intend to live to be 100 and watch him grow up and eventually get shot by a jealous husband, hopefully.
Brilliant.
Apart from that, yeah, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, the future's good for us. We've been lucky, I think. I've had a couple of bits of luck in my life. First of all, was having a mother like I did. Although Mum left school when she was 14, being the oldest of 6, but she could have been anything. She's a very intelligent lady, very well read, self-taught. The second one was meeting my wife, because she's kept me straight all these years. I'd probably be still living in a bed sitting Bishopston if I hadn't met her. Having a daughter that I have. My daughter meeting her husband, now Tom, I couldn't have imagined that she would fall in love with somebody that we fall in love with as well. Such a lovely man. Yeah, I've been lucky, I think.
Lots to be thankful for.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's more to come, with the baby.
Lovely. Thanks, Paul.
Not at all.
Cheers.